everybody, and welcome to our National Virtual Workshop. My name's Kelson. I'm a fitness and sport instructor based out of Borden. Today, I'm going to be taking you guys through a lunge movement analysis. We're going to take you through the basic anatomy of the lunge. You'll learn what your primary, secondary, and maybe tertiary muscles are going to be with that exercise. We're going to review some progressions and regressions of the lunge, depending on where you're at. Once we finish getting through the different levels of progression and regressions, we're going to take you guys through some mobility drills that you can apply to your daily training to help get you better at the lunge position. Once we finish with our mobility drills, I'll close the video off with demonstrating and talking about some common errors that we will see as we execute really any of these variations of lunges. I'm very excited to bring this content to you. I find that the lunge is a very underutilized training exercise. So yeah, before we get started into the exciting portion of this lesson, we do have a disclaimer that we have to cover. So for your own safety, please make sure that you take time to read the disclaimer in the description section of this video before you start the virtual workshop. That being said, let's go ahead and jump headfirst into the content. To begin our first segment here, we're going to be reviewing some functional anatomy of our lunge patterns. Depending on the variation that we use for the lunge, it will bias certain muscles to work potentially a little bit harder in the movement pattern. But typically speaking, we're looking at a few global primary movers, secondary movers, and stabilizers. So let's start with our kind of neutral lunge position, the one that most people will be familiar with. We're going to look at our front leg in front, our back leg extended behind us, my knee follows behind my hips, my front leg, the shin is nice and vertical, we've got about a 90-degree bend, same idea with my back leg. So functionally, our hamstrings are going to be responsible for controlling the descent into this 90-degree position. As I come out of the hole, I extend that front leg, thus activating the quad. My backside here, my glutes, are helping to stabilize along with my core while I'm in this split stance position. You will have some contributions as well for stability with our feet, our ankles, and our calves. Now, depending on how we execute our lunge, perhaps if we have more forward traveling, even reverse potentially. Our calves and our feet are going to be responsible for loading those impact forces. So you're going to have some eccentric loading on our calves as well as the hamstrings, depending on which variation of the lunge you're going to cover. Okay? Long story short, lunges are targeting the front of the leg, the back of the leg, as well as our glutes. You get secondary benefits being core and hip stability, as well as foot and ankle stability. That would be pretty well it for the functional anatomy for the scope of this video. Again, as we change the variation, there's going to be some muscles that are more biased than others. But at the end of the day, these are the primary muscles that we're looking to target when we get into our lunge patterns. So now that we have a better understanding of what our functional anatomy of our lunge pattern is, we can now better understand the pros and cons of selecting the lunge as an exercise in your training program. Let's start off with the downsides of the lunge. There aren't many, but there are a few that we need to bring to the forefront of consideration. First and foremost, when we're lunging, the load eventually becomes very difficult for you to support in a good position. So what I mean to say is if I use my kettlebell here as an example for my front load, when we're lunging, typically we're going to have this front rack position. We come into our front squat, our split stance position, and I go through my lunge. Eventually, the amount of weight that I can easily bring up to this front rack position is going to be my limiting factor. Unfortunately, it's going to be very hard for you to kind of clean and secure a 100-pound dumbbell in that front rack position, right? So that would be one of the first downsides of selecting the lunge. The reduced weight is offset by the fact that we're only really using a single leg. So you're doing more work per leg with less weight, if that makes sense, compared to, say, a squat with the bar on your back. So keep that in mind. There's other ways to get around this. You can look at loading your torso with a vest. You can look at holding dumbbells down by your side. That'll make it a little bit easier. But even still, once you get past like 60 pounds in each hand, the grip strength required to secure the load then becomes your limiting factor versus the strength of your leg. So the next downside with the lunge is the potential for injury. As we move especially to our more advanced variations with our lunge, the risk to reward can become quite high. Obviously, as we start to bias one leg and we start incorporating more balance under load, the risk for injury goes up. There's no way to get around it, right? So this is where it becomes important that you pick the right load and the right exercise for you as an individual, not just because you saw something cool on social media and you want to try it, right? And last and not least, and it kind of stems from that potential of injury, working with these lunges and progressing them requires a ton of focus and a ton of patience, okay? Most of us are super gummed up in hip extension, which is going to be a big component of our lunge. If we're not good here and we're not mobile through the hips, it makes learning how to lunge very difficult and uncomfortable, right? What you'll end up seeing is, as you take your nice big step back and we get down to the bottom, oh, my hip's too tight. I can't support a good position. But that's pretty well it. So load is hard to carry at a certain point. The potential for injury is higher as you start to get onto a single leg, as well as it requires you to have focus and patience as you're learning these new skills. Now let's talk about the upsides, because man, there's a ton of them. First and foremost, very much like our squat and a lot of our other loaded movements, the adaptations that you can get out of this exercise are numerous. So you can train for muscular growth or hypertrophy. You can train for explosive strength or power. You can train for raw strength, like 5 rep max, 1 rep max, that kind of thing. And then also endurance. And then the coolest part for me, because I'm a big mobility guy, is it improves your mobility. The lunge is in essence a weighted mobility exercise for our hips, right? We've got hip flexion and hip extension. So we get to open up through our groin, we get to open up through our hips, and we get to do it under load. So if you're a big, strong guy and you find static stretching is hard because you need a little something extra to get you into the position, maybe the lunge is the right choice for you. So it's versatile is what I'm getting at. Pretty well any kind of adaptation you want to make, you can get through a lunge. Secondly, single leg exposure. So yes, the back squat is the king of heavy loads. You cannot put more weight in a lunge than you can do in a back squat. But when we're talking about operational requirements and athletic activities, how often are you going to have to do a maximal 1 rep thing with the load positioned across your back with both feet flat on the floor? In real life, that scenario just really doesn't happen all that often. Most real life dynamic activities are based around our gait, our walking sequence, which is single leg, right? So one of the perks of the lunge, especially as we start to progress, is we get access to loading that single leg, right? Whether we're doing cuts in sport or we're potentially picking something up, we're trying to resist external forces on a single leg. There's lots of instances where that single leg position is going to come up in real life, and this offers you a great way to safely train that stimulus. This leads us to the next point, is it's a more athletically complete movement. Again, it just comes down to the simple fact that most movements will find us in this split stance position. Again, there are opportunities for us to find both feet on the floor, but typically speaking, we're working with one foot in contact. And that's pretty well it, right? At the end of the day, the lunge is just a more realistic simulation of what you could be expected to face. So not to say that bilateral both feet on the floor doesn't have its points, but the single leg training stimulus is super, even more important, I would say, for training in terms of athletic and operational development. The last part, and it kind of comes back to this bilateral, both feet on the ground kind of concept. Most of us are dominant to one side. I know I'm right side dominant, right? When I squat, especially if it's a super heavy load, I'm definitely aware that I like to bias my one side more than the other, or at least I feel more activation, if that makes sense. So this single leg stimulus will give us access to creating some muscular and neuromuscular symmetry in our body. That's pretty well it, guys. So it's versatile, it gives you access to single leg exposure, it's a more athletic way to train your leg muscles, and that's pretty well it for the pros, right? There's not really too much more to consider here. The only other thing that I would talk about as far as like pros and cons, once you start to add traveling into our lunge components, so like front lunge, reverse lunge, although the second one will have less, as you start to add those traveling moments where we're disconnecting from the ground, that's going to be kind of like the higher end of the lunge sequence, right? Most of the stuff I'm going to show you is going to be static and without movement. So one of the cons to a lunge is like as soon as you start traveling, impact forces go through the roof on your tissue and on your joints. So just keep that in mind as you're going through your progressions. If you've never done lunges before, don't start with a traveling lunge because that's how you can hurt yourself. That being said, let's get into the exciting meat and potatoes section of this video, guys. I'm going to take you through our different regressions and progressions for our lunge. In this section, we're going to be covering how to look at a lunge and figure out whether or not we need to regress or progress the exercise that we're using. First, let's start by evaluating and recognizing the different components of progression and regression. As it comes to the lunge, as well as many other exercises that you can think of, we're looking at really a handful of things that we can influence. So we want to look at the stability of the exercise. Using our standard neutral lunge, we want to look at, is there a way that I can either make this position more or less stable? So more stable would be wider stance, maybe even external support like a dowel. Right, so I'm really eliminating any requirement for me to have to think about stabilizing the movement. On the opposite end of the spectrum, to make something more challenging, we need a more narrow stance. So instead of nice and wide, we can potentially think about shortening things to hip distance, maybe even tightrope, super narrow, right? That would be focusing more on your core, hip, feet, and ankle stabilizers versus like the sheer weight and strength of the movement. Remember, as stability goes down, so does our load tolerance. So you can't lift the same weight as you could on a flat surface as you could in an unstable surface, right? Concepts are the same with lunging. The bigger and wider I can go, the more weight chances are that I can move versus narrow, less weight. Make sense? Moving on from there, we have load. So load is just like how much weight we're moving with our legs. So there's two ways we can do this. We can look at manipulating gravity or adding external load with like a vest, dumbbells, weights, etc. looking at how to influence, gravity and load. A simple way to do this would be if we are to come down to our split stance position and I'm just shifting my bias onto this front leg. I'm manipulating gravity. I'm manipulating how much weight is being focused on this front leg. So just by kind of shifting my intent with the movement, I can make that exercise more challenging. Conversely, trying to reduce the load or manipulate gravity so that it's going to be easier to do the exercise. If that doesn't make sense, I know the gravity thing can be kind of an abstract concept, but you'll see what I mean when I go through my very first version of the lunge. Secondly, we're looking at range of motion. So the more range of motion the lunge variation requires, the more difficult it's going to be, right? This lunge requires potentially less mobility than my rear foot elevated lunge, which is more extension, versus my airborne lunge, which is going to be a lot more range of motion. So moving into a bigger space is going to make the exercise more challenging, right? Longer step in a traveling lunge, wider stance in that static lunge position. You get the idea. Again, often with an increase in range of motion, you're going to see a reduction in the amount of load that you can carry initially. You can balance it out, but you will see a drop in your numbers initially. The next kind of progression, regression there is speed. I don't really like to play with this one too much just because generally speaking, when we're doing a single leg movement, I want you to move at a controlled tempo at all times. The only time you're going to be progressing with speed is if you move into a plyometric situation, right? Where we add some potential jumping, right? Last and not least, the single leg dominance. So as I go through my progressions of the lunge, you're going to see that I'm adding more and more and more emphasis on targeting one leg, okay? So that would be our progression and regression simple scale. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate what these things look like. We're going to go through the exercises themselves. I'll talk about how to execute them, as well as some kind of good benchmarks to hit before you move to the next lunge variation. So my first variation that I'm going to show you is a front foot elevated lunge. This is a great starting point for someone who already potentially has knees that don't agree well with a lunge. For whatever reason, maybe you have a previous injury or it just doesn't feel good. This lunge is going to allow us to have as much external support as we need, and it's going to allow us to strengthen our knee through its full range of motion, okay? So we're not just starting with our neutral lunge because it doesn't express as much range of motion as we should have access to in our ankles, knees, and hips. I'll explain what I mean. I'm going to start off with a nice high box, and I'm going to have lots of external support, especially if you have a bad knee or you've never done this before. These external supports are going to make it so that this exercise is very safe and very controlled. So I approach my box, which is going to be just about knee height here. I'm going to elevate my front foot elevated lunge or split squat, whatever word you want to use. I pop my toe back so that I'm right up on the ball of my foot. I'm getting lots of support from my dowels and I'm shifting my weight forward, keeping my knee tracking with my big and middle toe. I spend a few seconds in the bottom position. I extend that front leg, using as much or as little support as you need from that dowel. I'm focusing on squeezing my glutes and extending my hip forward. So you can see in the bottom position here, the mobility requirements. We've got full ankle flexion, we've got full knee flexion, and full hip flexion. Okay? We've got wicked hip extension. I'm feeling a very strong stretch in that back hip. Just so you guys can see it from another side here. Tall torso on my toes, squeezing the glutes, and very controlled, not working through any pain. I come back out of the movement. So I chose this as our basic level number 1 lunge because it exposes people to a lot of range of motion that they just don't typically get through their regular workouts. So I would start here, even if you're super proficient at lunging, right? Start with this one because you're gonna see the mobility requirements of that exercise. And that's going to help us, if we can own that position, it'll help us to bulletproof ourselves as we get more and more advanced. The next step is going to be with our standard lunge. It's going to be the one that I've demonstrated most often. That's with our split stance. Nice tall torso. I'm engaging my back toe, squeezing the glutes, and I'm dropping in a straight line down towards the floor. I press off that front leg. Again, especially if you're still trying to learn this movement, use your regressions, so give yourself as much stability as possible through external support. Nice big step back. Focus on just traveling in a straight line up and down. Do a couple reps on the other side here as well. So nice tall stance, step back with your one leg. Make sure that the ball of your foot is active. My knee is falling behind my hip. And I drop that back knee to the floor, staying nice and tall, pressing off that front foot. Progression is just getting rid of your external support. Then you can start to go a little bit faster, etc. All the different progression markers that we talked about. So this is where things are going to start to get very interesting. Most people stop with that standard lunge where they have the split stance. I'm going to actually keep this so that I can show you the next progression, regression. So the next one is going to be a rear foot elevated lunge or split squat. Just depends on what your vernacular is. So again, if I'm just starting off with this rear foot elevated split squat, my objective is to be as stable as I can. Trying to get as much external support. So, nice and tall, stick my back foot onto the box. I give myself maybe a little hop forward, right? I want to already feel a bit of stretch through my hip flexors in this position. Squeeze your glutes so that you've got lots of stability. And as we go down, I'm looking to keep the tracking of my shin relatively vertical. We can have some knees towards the toes action, that's okay, but to keep things as safe as possible, we would keep that shin nice and vertical. My feet in contact with the floor and pressing off that front leg. Now, for those of you who don't do this a lot, man, especially in this bottom position, your hip flexor and your quads are going to be screaming, right? So only go as deep into the position as you feel you have control and can muster strength out of the bottom. So if you go to the bottom position and it kind of looks like this, you get to the bottom and you're just like, ugh, like you just can't support the position, don't go as deep. That range of motion will come with practice and time, right? Our tissue's mobility doesn't respond as quickly as its strength. So I could say that, you know, you could up your weight each week with the lunge if you were doing like linear progression, but like there's going to be a point where you lose the quality of movement just by chasing that load. So, you know, make sure you feel comfortable with no external support. You can do your body weight, and this will hold true for our first demonstration as well. If you can get through 3 sets of about 10 reps on both sides, that's a great indication that you've developed enough strength to at least flirt with moving to the next progression, right? Spend as long as you need. There's no rush, right? You have your whole life to try to build up the mobility to get to that rear foot elevated split squat, right? Take your time and do these exercises with intention, and that's going to avoid injury a lot of the time. So as we get to our next piece, this will be our 4th most advanced variation on our lunge. It's the Airborne Lunge. So again, starting from the top, trying to get as much external support as I can with a new movement. I'm going to use a block here. It's going to pad my knees as well as reduce the range of motion requirements for this airborne lunge initially. And then of course, I have my external support with my dowels. So what am I doing? I start in a nice tall stance, standing like with the block in between my feet. I'm going to be working with this right leg, the leg that's in front here. So I'm going to curl my left heel towards my butt, and maybe I want to move that block just slightly over so it falls underneath my knee. Keeping that heel curl and hips pushed forward, I'm going to sit down into that single leg, tracking where the block is just so you can rest on it. From this position, you'll see that I've got a bit of a forward knee position here, as well as my torso is slightly angled forward versus more of an upright typical lunge. This is just simply for balance, right? You could potentially do this with a completely jacked up neutral spine, but it doesn't feel very comfortable. So that's why I allow for a little bit of a forward torso position, and also this is more athletic. When we got the one leg in front and our one hip trailing in extension, think about a sprinter's position, right? So from the bottom up here, I can use the dowels, get as much support as I want, coming up off the floor onto that single leg. So reducing or progressing the movement, I'm reducing external stability. I still, no matter what, usually like to have some sort of pad on the ground, just because there's a good chance that as you start to fatigue, you're going to come into that bottom position hot, and the likelihood of you banging your knee on the floor is, can be high. So a little bit of padding never hurts. So from here, I'm going to take a nice big step back. Boom, contact the block, squeezing the hands, coming back up to a standing position. We'll do the other side here. Single leg position, curl the heel to the butt. I'm reaching this leg backwards as I squat down. Contact the block, come back up to a tall position. At its pinnacle, we have no external support. We're using full range of motion. Notice the tempo that I'm using. This isn't a fast movement. And there you have it, folks. That's our lunging progression from its most fundamental level. That's the front foot elevated lunge or split squat. Our next more neutral variation would be that regular 90 degree lunge, playing around with the width of the stance, etc., external support. Once you're able to, work through that exercise, 3 sets, 10 reps, both sides, no pain, relative comfort, maybe you get a good pump, right? Then, okay, let's move to our rear foot elevated split squat or rear foot elevated lunge. The progression here is, again, we're putting more onus on the single leg versus sharing the load over the two. And it's turning more into a balancing act, right? We're working with our one back foot elevated. This incorporates more foot, ankle, hip, and core stability. And then our final kind of apex of the lunge, we have that airborne lunge. So I'm on exclusively a single leg. I'm using maximum of motion to try to be as strong on that one leg as I can. So I hope you guys can understand the concepts of progression and regression as I've tried to highlight them with those 4 exercises. Let's get started really quick. We'll talk about mobility next. As promised, guys, we're going to go into some mobility drills here with regards to our lunge position. So let's examine, first of all, the main restrictions that we'll experience when we're getting into the lunge. 90% of the time we're looking at missing hip extension, missing hip internal, external rotation, or our feet are jacked up and we can't flex our toes or our ankles. So there's a few simple drills that I like. I'll preface all of these drills with we're looking at a minimum 2-minute hold in each of these positions. 2 minutes is how long it takes for our tissue to recognize and create some sort of adaptation in the stretch. 30 seconds, unfortunately, just will not cut it. So if you want to get good at running, squatting, and lunging, invest in these drills, okay? So first of all, we have, I call it a thinker stretch. So I come down to the ground here with my hands. I take my one leg. I'll actually work on the opposite side so you can observe this front leg. I drag the top of my foot across the floor until it gets right underneath my hip. I make sure that I sit back onto my heel with my foot flat. Nice tall torso position. And this is it, guys. We're looking at full ankle dorsiflexion, full knee flexion, and full hip flexion. These are the markers for squatting and lunging, right? Especially if you're looking to get that nice, butt to grass style squat. So we're going through this position for 2 minutes. I'm breathing, I'm flossing in and out of the position. Maybe you don't get too much of a stretch. Look at your heel. Make sure the foot's flat on the ground and we've dragged that other leg as close to our hips as we can. If you still want more, you can take an extra load. Nothing too crazy. This is an 8-kilogram kettlebell, and I'm just placing it on my thigh to help accentuate the stretch. 2 minutes on both sides. Nice foot forward, drag that back foot right underneath our hips. And again, if you want it, you can add a little bit of external load. 2 minutes. So really, primarily, I'm looking at targeting my ankle joint here. This is the big one. All this other stuff just kind of falls into place once you've got that good ankle mobility. The other thing that I like to try to work on is a deep lunge flow. So this is gonna really benefit any variation of the lunge that we're pursuing, especially if we're really tight through that long split stance position. So I'm here, front foot in front, back foot goes as far back as I can muster, both hands come down to the ground. Now in this position, I'm shifting my body around through space. I'm drawing body circles, right? The little micro shifts here is gonna help you to relax deeper into the position. You can start to increase the distance between your 2 feet. Eventually this turns into the splits, right? You can see where I'm going with that. Other considerations in this position is make sure that your glutes are squeezed, because that'll really emphasize that hip extension, which is a big chunk of what we're missing. And if you look at this back foot, you'll see that my toes are active and I'm pressing back through the heel. So that's going to help us address that toe restriction in our lunge position as well. Some other considerations is extending the front leg to hit the hamstrings, resetting, back knee to the floor, squeeze the bum, and slight heel curl. That'll help to target your hip flexors and quads. 2 minutes, just playing around in this position. Then of course we have to switch sides. Extension, flexion, good. And last but not least, guys, this is probably my favorite stretch period, mostly because we spend so much time in this seated position. It's going to be the couch stretch. Hopefully you guys are familiar with it. If not, this will be a nice little mind-blowing stretch for you. You're going to take, at least a knee-height surface. For me, this is a perfect height for the box because it allows me to flex my foot on top. Anyways, long story short, just under the knee is perfect height, but do it on your couch. There's a reason they call it a couch stretch, right? So I get down to the ground. If we can imagine that this is a wall as well versus a couch or a stool, I get as close to the item as I can. I curl my heel to my butt so that my shin gets nice and vertical.
nice and flush with that wall, chair, couch, whatever tool I'm using. For some of us, even this position, squeezing the glutes and driving the hips forward, maybe this is enough stretch for us, right? The objective here is, while keeping this shin parallel with the wall, I want to be able to eventually build myself up into this tall lunge position with a nice strong glute squeeze. We've got a posterior pelvic tilt, I believe that is, scooping the hips towards the front. And this is it. I hold this position for 2 minutes, right? Doing both sides. Biggest thing is not to get upright, because we can cheat this by like extending through our spine in a couple of other ways. The big point here is to keep that shin flush with the wall and don't overextend through your spine. So we build ourselves up. I take a minute here to breathe, relax. I'm not feeling any crunching or extension through the back, so I can build myself up and up and up and up and up and up. Eventually we can get shoulders to the wall, but that's a long way away, right? So those would be my go-to mobility drills for trying to improve a lunge or even a squatting position. Because if we put on our thinking caps, we can start to recognize that a single leg lunge in really any variation is really just half of a squat position, right? Squat position, squat position, squat position. So this is why I kept switching up between a lunge and a single leg split squat, rear foot elevated split squat. Because at the end of the day, like, they are so very similar. It's just really focusing on one being bilateral, so that's the squat, both feet, or unilateral, which is the lunge, right? That's pretty well it for the mobility section. Let's go ahead and review some common errors and finish with a quick close. So as some closing thoughts here, some things to consider as we go through our lunges and we're navigating, learning this new technique or optimizing the technique we're already using. There are some very common faults that I see continuously with everybody executing these variations of lunges. First and foremost, the stability aspect is the most important. I see all too often people lunging and moving around and not owning what they're doing. If you can't connect to the floor, drop down, and come back up without losing your balance, it's a good chance you're moving too fast, okay? So speed, take your time, slow it down. Slow tempo is always better for single leg unless you're doing an explosive movement like jumping. Don't overload the movement too quickly. Again, you're gonna have strength differences between the left side and the right side, whatever one's more dominant. So let your weaker side be the limiting factor for your weight. Don't do your right side first, discover you're stronger and you can't do as many reps, right? Make sure you execute the movement with as full range of motion as you have access to. Over time, that range of motion is gonna become greater. When you get new range of motion, it's a good recommendation to, again, drop your load. You're moving into a longer position, which requires your muscles to contract from a longer length. So if you're using the same weight in a deeper range, there's a potential for injury. That's basically it. Take your time, pay attention, and don't move too quickly, right? At the end of the day, as far as progression goes, you could be very satisfied with that rear foot elevated lunge or rear foot elevated split squat. That airborne lunge is really just kind of the pinnacle of expression of mobility and strength through our lower extremities. So by no means do you have to go that far. At some point, you kind of just have to decide when is good enough good enough. That rear foot elevated lunge or split squat gives you access to a full range of motion. You're loading that front leg as much as you really can without going airborne, that one foot just floating. And have fun with the process, guys. If you ever get stuck or you need something troubleshooted, reach out to your local fitness and sports staff. We're always happy to talk technique and troubleshoot. Thank you for tuning in as always. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. If you have any comments, questions, leave it below in the comments section. As always, guys, keep training, stay safe, and most importantly, have fun.